Fortunately, I can say most of the time I am very happy.
This video is not what I originally had planned. I started working on this after my second playthrough of Alan Wake 2, a game that, in my nearly 4 decades of video gaming, I would happily describe as the greatest game I've ever played. An incredibly well put together, thoughtful, exciting and entertaining game, unlike anything I had ever played before. It was a game that made me smile more than any other when I was playing it, but also made me think about life through its lens in a way that great art always should. I had just started to get to grips with the basics of video editing software and wanted to make my first video essay as a love letter to the game, looking at Remedy Studios, their history, uniqueness, and the influences they both acknowledge and have had on other game developers since coming to prominence following their success with the first Max Payne. Then something happened, something that could not simply be a side note when working on this mission statement. On January 16th, 2025, it was announced that legendary artist, writer, director and actor David Lynch had passed away. The news was utterly heartbreaking for me, as it was for many of his fans. I know that there are many videos out there documenting his life and films, but the timing just seemed too important for me not to rethink the subject matter of my first video essay, as, for reasons I hope will become clear, the very reason that Remedy games and specifically Alan Wake 2 had resonated with me, and the effect that David Lynch had on me, were not entirely unrelated. To put across the effect that Lynch's work had on so many of us, and why he was arguably one of the most important artistic creators ever to grace the surface of this often bewildering and emotionally crippling planet, I'm going to do something that, in the current film and television zeitgeist, is becoming increasingly popular. I'm going to take you back to the 90s. The early 1990s. I was starting high school in my hometown in rural Suffolk. For any younger viewers out there, 90s high school, especially in England, was categorically not Saved by the Bell, or even Stranger Things. The country was coming out of a decade of Thatcherism, and, as is often the case in times like these, everybody craved escapism. For the vast majority of high schoolers, this was football. Being one of the 2% of high school males who had no interest in this and instead preferred reading, mostly Stephen King, R.L. Stine or Dean Koontz, or watching films, made it very hard to find common ground with my fellow preteens. I even once had a very brief flirtation with feigning an interest in sports, just because it felt overwhelmingly like a social norm. That went about as well as you'd expect.
Ray, he's kicked the ball. Now the ball's over there. That man has it now. I want to go back to being weird. I like being weird. Weird's all I've got.
So while most of the people my own age had pastimes they could enthusiastically discuss on lunch breaks and games they enjoyed playing together on the school playground, my interests never really translated. My sister recently unearthed some old paperwork which included notes on a presentation I gave my English class on graphic novels, specifically horror film adaptations and how the mediums compared, in which I transplanted frames from the graphic novelisation of Child's Play 2 onto an overhead projector sheet. And I would add, for anyone not currently considering the need for a prostate check, please feel free to Google that.
Ooh, nasty.
The only other of my high school projects I recall from that time was a presentation on vampiric lore around Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, in all honesty, I mostly cribbed from the sleeve of my Christopher Lee Reed's Hammer Horrors Dracula LP. Yeah, I was literally the Creepshow kid.
I apologize.
Shut the fuck up!
The television at the time was mostly awful. There was the occasional entertaining news series, though most of the best TV, at least in my opinion, was reruns of classic shows that stood the test of time. But for the most part it was tacky game shows, awful soap operas, and sitcoms that were about as funny as getting a parking ticket, then having it read to you by James Corden, with additional material supplied by Jim Davidson. Oh yeah, that had a game show as well. So I quite enjoyed that one. But I was always more interested in darker subject matter, with even the more mainstream films that appealed to me as a child often containing a dark or supernatural edge. Then suddenly, on the 23rd of October 1990, something magical happened. A new TV show from David Lynch and Mark Frost aired on BBC Two. This was like nothing that had ever been broadcast on television before. Ostensibly a murder mystery series, it somehow managed to be intriguing, captivating, funny, imaginative, aesthetically beautiful, and fucking terrifying. Though most of the show's more mature themes probably washed straight over my 11-year-old head, I was completely hooked. It was as if some benevolent entity had created the show just for me.
I got you a present. It's a thumb.
To appeal to every aspect of my personality.
A complete solipsist, a raging egomaniac.
I loved the town of Twin Peaks. I wanted to live there. I wanted to learn about the underlying mysteries that were evidently bubbling under the surface. I wanted to eat cherry pie and drink coffee at the Double R Diner, and I'd be remiss if I failed to mention Audrey Horne. As catalysts for prepubescent sexual awakenings go, nobody came close to Sherilyn Fenn. Well, maybe Jet from Gladiators.
It's enough to make any young man turn cartwheels.
Though the show was groundbreaking, it was not a consistent mainstream success. By the time season 2 came around, which, largely as a result of network meddling, suffered from a lack of direction and some unnecessary padding, viewership was dwindling. The artistic choices behind Twin Peaks were what made it different to and better than anything on mainstream TV at the time, but in a corporate mandated effort to make the series more in line with traditional TV fodder, Lynch and Frost were reluctantly forced to reveal the identity of Laura Palmer's killer.
Fucking morons.
Which diminished the drive behind the story as a whole. There was still some great stuff in season 2, such as the appearance of Laura's cousin Maddie, which gave the immensely talented Cheryl Lee something to do other than being a body on a slab. The Owl Cave, more of the Black Lodge, and the introduction of Wyndham Earle, who acted as a Moriarty to Cooper's Holmes, and opened the door for a brief Ted Raimi cameo, which is always welcome. But there was also lots of bullshit, where the show's deliberately satirical elements of soap opera parody started to cross the line and somewhat lose their sense of irony. Yes, I'm looking right at you, James and Evelyn's subplot. The show was cancelled after season 2, ending with a Lynch-helmed finale that brought Twin Peaks back to its tonal roots, but also leaving fans with arguably the most tortuous and prolonged cliffhanger in broadcast history. Despite this, the show maintained a solid fan base, and that loyalty was eventually repaid with some resolution, and after a brief spell of
5 years.
we were rewarded with season 3 of Twin Peaks, which I can honestly say was one of the greatest pieces of literal art ever to be broadcast on network television. But I'll come back to that. I went on to become a huge fan of Lynch, whose continuing filmography featured some of the most impactful, beautiful, insightful, yet haunting pieces of cinema ever made. So, what does all this have to do with Remedy games? If you're of a certain age, you'll no doubt have been asked at regular intervals, do you remember where you were on September the 11th, 2001? For me, that's easy. I was in New York. Not the real New York, but the pulpy, reimagined New York of Max Payne, a dark landscape engulfed in snow, corruption and violence that somehow managed to be less bleak than the real New York of that otherwise beautiful summer's day that I would see on endless 24/7 news stories for weeks to come. Seeing those towers in the beautiful graphic novel art of the game's cutscenes, then hearing of their destruction, just sends a strange shockwave through me. The sudden removal of something so seemingly permanent and iconic in an act of premeditated murder, well, there's a reason that day burns itself onto the psyche of so many. On a lighter note, the game itself was fantastic and, like Twin Peaks, was something of a cultural landmark in my life. Dark and gritty games were not something new, but the style of storytelling with the obvious inspirations from pulp detective fiction and the Hong Kong action films of the 80s and 90s was a sublime combination. I would argue that it was easily the most cinematic game I had played up to that point, and it had a distinctive narrative development and gameplay style that no doubt influenced some of the more culturally significant games to have appeared since its release nearly a quarter of a century ago. Though, I have to confess, my awareness of Remedy games and of their creative director, Sam Lake, never went any further for many years.
Here's the pulse, alright? And this is your finger. Far from the pulse, jammed straight up your ass.
I vaguely remembered that it was made by Rockstar and another studio, and probably assumed that, like many of the games developers of the 90s and early 2000s that influenced so many of us, this other studio had either been shuttered or been consumed by one of the monolithic development corporations, forced to churn out mass appeal games for as long as they were viable, then abandoned. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I would highly recommend Stephanie Sterling's great video entitled Unichronic Arts, where they look at this odious corporate behavioural trend which has continued to this day. But then, in mid-2024, I happened across the remastered version of Alan Wake. Knowing that the follow-up game had been released and was said to be great, seeing it available to play on PlayStation Plus, and having missed it the first time on account of it being an Xbox exclusive, and probably having preemptively written it off as another subpar Resident Evil or Silent Hill clone, I was instantly captivated, and couldn't help thinking that it reminded me of something I had played a long time ago. Not long after this random firing of barely connected neurons, who should make a guest appearance on the in-game talk show but Sam Lake.
Sam Lake. Once more, do the face for us, Sam. There it is. And hard.
The face of Max Payne, but more importantly, though unknown to me at the time,
Would you like a chocolate-covered pretzel?
the creative director and driving force behind Remedy Games. What followed was something of a Remedy Games fanboy crash course, with me playing through Control, which was phenomenally good, sadly not being able to play Quantum Break, but being psyched for the second Alan Wake game. What also became more apparent was the influence that Lake had taken from David Lynch, both in terms of style and subject matter. I had obviously picked up on some of the more minor yet on-the-nose references to his works,
Scary.
but there was now a very clear correlation of deep and insightful analysis of the human psyche, of the best and worst of humanity and how to understand it, a subject that was the life work of psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Stephen King once wrote, "Monsters are real, ghosts are too. They live inside of us, and sometimes they win." Carl Gustav Jung was a contemporary of noted psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, though they had something of a professional falling out over their perceptions of both the origins of and treatments for underlying psychological conditions.
That's my life as a prostitute by your mum.
Jung would go on to explore his ideas of what constitutes a human psyche, how it develops, how it sometimes fails us, and how to healthily master it. Most notably, the philosophy that we consist of multiple layers of consciousness, with only the most superficial aspects of our psychology, generally for most people, used in our day-to-day lives. He postulated that, in an effort to conform to the society around us, we suppress certain elements of ourselves, but that this suppression is psychologically unhealthy, and that the only way to become a stable and happy individual is to acknowledge these elements, which he referred to as our shadow selves. It seemed fairly obvious that the ability for people to function in any social setting, be it, for example, a schoolyard or a workplace, depends on a certain amount of personal control over their instinctive reactive self. At some point as a child, you will no doubt have encountered an adult who is saying something manifestly stupid or behaving in a way that you can see is not acceptable, but perhaps, having been brought up to never answer back to a grown-up, felt powerless to say anything. Similarly, the structural hierarchy of a workplace does not always allow for self-expression, or for what you perceive to be the right thing to be said or done, without a risk to one's livelihood. It is easy to see how these can lead to ingrained behaviours and a natural instinct to hide ourselves behind a mask, with many parts of your psyche locked away deep within you and for you to deal with alone. The trouble with this, according to Jung, is that your shadow self is never truly gone, and, if continually suppressed, can begin to manifest itself in adverse thoughts and behaviours. So Jung urged that we acknowledge and even embrace our shadows, that we find ways to incorporate them into our daily lives. Jung also felt that the human consciousness was an untapped field of creativity, knowledge and self-awareness, and that nurturing our instinctive nature and embracing every part of it, including the shadow self, is the key to becoming a better person, to achieving our full potential, and to making the world a better place. He gave practical advice to achieve this, such as keeping dream journals to analyse and understand our subconscious selves, as interpreted through said dreams, and to acknowledge and then interrogate negative aspects of our personality. Crucially, realising that they exist, that they should not be the cause of guilt or self-flagellation, but a catalyst for understanding ourselves better, to be aware of and prepared for our own shortcomings, and to find practical ways to incorporate these parts of ourselves into our lives. Jung referred to this as shadow work. Artistic expression is perhaps the obvious example of how to achieve this successfully. Every dark event that occurs in the works of David Lynch, Sam Lake, Stephen King, or any other great creative writer is a thought that had occurred to them. Ideas about the worst things of which humanity is capable, captured, accepted, and re-engineered into narratives that speak to us about good, evil, and the often overlooked grey areas in between. A tradition that dates back to the earliest campfire folklore, or the dark tales we tell our children to educate them about the dangers of the world, or at least used to, before Disney and Ladybird books got a hold of them. Conversely, when looking for a potential example of how a lack of shadow work and self-reflection can make the world a worse place, there are many examples, though my first thoughts go to certain religious institutions, where a veneer and self-perception of infallible holy righteousness, combined with religiously inspired celibacy and repression of and guilt about human sexual nature, has led to, or appears, at least anecdotally, to have led to a disproportionate demographic representation of sexual dysfunction, leading to some of the worst crimes of which a human can be guilty.
Now that if you call my
We
assistant...
have reason to believe that there are allegations against as many as 87 priests in Boston.
I can't talk to you about that.
There are countless examples of Jungian successes, failures, and continuing personal journeys across the works of both Lynch and Lake. From the disassociation from both reality and accountability of Fred Madison in Lost Highway, or Diane Selwyn in Mulholland Drive, through to arguably Lynch's most famous creation, Laura Palmer, who would have every justification in the world to be consumed by her shadow self, given the amount of abuse and suffering she endured in the years before her murder. Though, despite her flaws, she tried to make the world a better place for the people of her town, realised that her best friend was taking a similar trajectory, taking her out of harm's way, and even prevented herself from becoming a vessel of evil, breaking the parent-child cycle of violence that seemed almost inevitable, even at the cost of her own life. Lake's work often touches on similar themes, from Max Payne's journey of vengeance to Control's Jesse and Dylan Faden both facing off against an entity that preys on the shadow selves of those it targets, but each with different outcomes. These themes have been expanded upon in recent years, with the last decade seeing the most recent instalments and some of the best work coming from both artists. The announcement of a third season of Twin Peaks was one of the most unexpected yet exciting events I can recall in recent media history. Of course, being a Lynch production, this was not going to be a nostalgic trip down memory lane or a blatant cash grab like so many other late-stage reboots.
I bypassed the compressor.
If his experiences on the original run of Twin Peaks, or June for that matter, a film that Lynch had more or less disowned following major creative differences with the studio, had one positive outcome, it was that, going forward, he only ever worked on projects where he had full creative control. No more pandering to trend-chasing executives or playing nice with a small army of additional screenwriters, even if this meant being creative with some of his own marketing.
What the f*** is David Lynch doing? He's just sitting on the f***ing corner of La Brea in Hollywood with a f***ing cow!
I went out with a cow and a placard for Laura Dern. And it was, a necessity because I didn't have the money to buy ads in the trades. And it brought awareness.
If you want to see the greatest performance of 2006, check out Laura Dern's performance in Inland Empire.
Season 3 was going to be David Lynch and Mark Frost's vision, and it showed. The series was, in my opinion, the single greatest thing ever aired on network television, and, like Alan Wake 2, seemed like a culmination of an entire body of work, with both stories featuring recurring themes from previous works, a distinctive style and story that had been built up over many years, meta scenes or plot points focusing on the relationship between an artist and their creation, a roster of trusted actors, some reprising existing roles, some taking on new ones, or in some cases perhaps both, a focus on the duality of human spirit, and most importantly, the overwhelming feeling that this is a story the artist wanted to tell. That a series like Twin Peaks or a game like Alan Wake 2, in spite of critical praise, will never see the immediate financial success of a Walking Dead or Call of Duty, as depressing a statement on our culture as it is, should not take away from their success as art. People will be talking about the works of Lynch and Lake for many years to come. As I have spent some time pointing out similarities, it's important to note that Sam Lake, who, among many other great Bond writers and developers, openly cites the works of David Lynch as one of his major inspirations, is not guilty of mere imitation. His works are truly original. Even when there may be a convergence of subject matter, he definitely brings his own unique storytelling style to his games. Just to illustrate, if you want an example of somebody who definitely admires and attempts to ape the style and subject matter of David Lynch, but does not have the creative talents of Sam Lake, look no further than our Lord Neil Breen. I won't go too far into this, but you can look him up on YouTube, and you can thank me later.
I knew you were here. I could feel your presence. I'm so ashamed.
Abstract art is not a get-out clause for being unable to write a coherent story or coming up with random non sequiturs when you've written yourself into a corner. To do it right takes skill. Lynch would not commit to a project until he was happy that it had made sense to him. When questioned about the likelihood of a 4th season of Twin Peaks, Lynch stated, "It's calling, but the signal has a lot of disturbances." We have seen glimpses of Sam Lake's process in various insight videos behind the scenes at Remedy Games, and can see the thought and effort that went into developing such a complex narrative, especially in the context of an interconnected universe. This is something else that both David Lynch and Remedy Games share. I mentioned earlier that my late discovery of Remedy's output was a pleasant surprise, but what must be clearly noted is that they are very much an outlier in having been creating their art in the games industry for as long as they have, and, importantly, while still retaining full creative control of their output. It is not too difficult to imagine an alternate timeline where, perhaps with their close proximity to Rockstar when making Max Payne, Remedy could have become entangled with a large studio like Take-Two Interactive, with the path to creating something as daring and original as Alan Wake 2 being near impossible in the face of artless corporate oversight. And nothing makes me sadder than thinking of the talented artists at Remedy Games potentially being caught up in the abuse, exploitation and layoffs that creators and other large studios have faced in recent years. Though, that said, if Sam Lake had gone on to work for Activision, he might have at least invoked some interesting alternative universe theory to explain world history in the Call of Duty universe, and not just made shit up. In any case, we can be thankful that he is who he is, and that he is where he is. Great artists are able to summon ideas and apply them through intuition. Those who are not fans of David Lynch often think of his works as weird for the sake of being weird.
I don't understand.
That's the whole point.
But nothing could be further from the truth. Anybody who was following the life of David Lynch will probably know that intuition was a part of his creative process. He had an unusually heightened sense of the beauty around him, which often became the juxtaposition to the darker elements within his stories.
In the dream, there was our world, and the world was dark because there weren't any robins, and the robins represented love. And for the longest time, there was just this darkness. And all of a sudden, thousands of robins were set free. And they flew down and brought this blinding light of love.
The elements of his work that many casual moviegoers would simply write off as weird, he referred to as abstractions. Those intuitive parts of life that perhaps negate a simplistic explanation but allude to something much bigger, more important, and more magnificent.
That, it doesn't make sense, or, people don't understand. Like, what do you think about that? And what would you say to other people who maybe like making things that other people don't think make sense?
I think I love ideas. I like a story that's got some concrete, structure, but also holds abstractions. Life is filled with abstractions, and the way we make heads or tails of it is through intuition.
He lived the Jungian ideal of being so in tune with his subconscious that he was able to use it to create masterpieces that spoke to his audiences on a frequency that perhaps they themselves didn't understand straight away, or could interpret and take away based on what it meant to them. The closing scene of Twin Peaks' last episode left me completely baffled initially, but my subconscious worked away at it in the background, and about halfway through the following day at work I understood it, or at least my interpretation of it, and it suddenly became an immensely satisfying and meaningful ending. This was how Lynch viewed art. It was not for him to dictate meaning.
Well, there's where you get why these things are, why everybody has a little something different to say. Yeah. Because it's up to, whoever's writing or whoever's viewing to, to make up their own mind about what's going on. So it wouldn't do any good for me to say, anymore.
His approach and access to his subconscious Lynch attributed largely to his interest in transcendental meditation. Like Carl Jung, he made use of free-flow consciousness exercises to better understand himself and allow his mind to freely, as he put it, get dreamy. Outside of sleep, especially in our noisy, busy, ad-filled world, we rarely get a chance to step back and simply enjoy our own minds. I've personally started using meditative practices in recent years, not because I'm a particularly mystical person, I'm not, though I think this perception of meditation is something that people can find off-putting.
The mindfulness movement as an extraction of spiritual principles from their theological underpinnings is a disrespectful thing.
Shut the fuck up!
But simply because I recognised that my brain was never going to take its foot off the gas. It helped in my attempts to become a better person and was invaluable to me in giving up drinking after 30 years of alcoholism. Thanks to Lynch, I had a grasp of what a shadow self was long before hearing the name Carl Jung.
There is also a legend of a place called the Black Lodge, the shadow self of the White Lodge. The legend says that every spirit must pass through there on the way to perfection. There you will meet your own shadow self. My people call it the dweller on the threshold.
The dweller on the threshold, waiting in the wings for a chance to take over when you lack the strength of spirit to be the best version of you. With the final episode of Season 2 of Twin Peaks acting as a nightmarish warning about how the dangers of being consumed by your darker self can be very real, this concept has been very much expanded upon by Sam Lake, who created the concept of the Taken within the Alan Wake games. Shadow versions of the people they once were, consumed by hate and violence. But these are not just archetypal zombies or infected. They are driven by the darkest thoughts and emotions of their victims. They verbalise the hatred within them, suppressed anger from their mundane day-to-day lives, now free to both speak and act out. Everybody has a shadow self, and, at least in my personal experience, those who think they don't are sometimes the most dangerous, suffering from both a lack of understanding of the human psyche combined with an inability to self-reflect. These are the people whose shadows manifest unchallenged in their daily lives, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large. With Lake's interpretation of shadow selves comes a useful thought exercise, a piece of shadow work of which I'm sure Jung would have approved. Imagine that you were to, this instant, be taken by the dark entity of the Remedyverse. How would you behave? What angry, suppressed thoughts would now come to the surface? What words would you be growling as you emerge from the darkness of the forest and approach the torch-bearing protagonist? Carl Stuckey was muttering angry statements about the difficult customers who leased his property. The park rangers expressed their anger at the people who made work for them by disregarding the rules of the forest. The lumberjacks had evidently felt that nobody listened to their advice on safely using dangerous equipment, and Mr. Scratch no doubt had a seething hatred of Alice Wake, with Alan's shadow self perhaps, like Barry and not unlike Jack Torrance in The Shining, blaming her and seeing her as an obstacle to success. Though we do later see, as do both Alan and Barry, that it was he who may well have held her back, and was certainly the reason she put her artistic aspirations on hold for the sake of his career. Alice was kind of awesome. Do this exercise once a day. Maybe you would find yourself angrily verbalising what you wished you had said to a manager at work during a particularly frustrating meeting, but didn't because of hierarchy, or what you would have said to the obnoxious customer but refrained as you don't want to deal with a complaint. In this reflection, you can try to objectively identify where the fault lies. Perhaps there is something in yourself you need to change. Perhaps you are letting these frustrations build up and taking them out on the wrong people. And, going back to Jung's idea of utilising your shadow self, perhaps there are people for whom you could break out your shadow self a little more often. Have you ever felt that you weren't assertive enough when standing up for yourself or when witnessing the unfair treatment of others? When you're at work and you see somebody abusing their power over another person, or you're in a store and you see somebody being outright rude to some poor cashier who cannot answer back for fear of losing their minimum pay job, then perhaps you should let your personal Mr. C out to play for a few minutes. No, not like that, but you know what I mean. There are bad people out there who make this world a much darker place, and it is much better that those people meet your shadow self than those around you who deserve you at your finest, Dougie. I feel I must emphasise that I'm not a qualified therapist.
No shit.
And like everyone, I'm still working on my personal journey, but these are just thought processes that I have found useful. And I wanted to show you how great art can genuinely affect us, hold up a mirror to ourselves and make us better people. But most of all, alongside my original plan of expressing my newfound love of Remedy games and the works of Remedy games, my highest priority is to say thank you, David Lynch. You are not just a filmmaker whose work I enjoyed, you are an artistic and spiritual role model to many. Your art has affected myself and others in innumerable ways. You made the world a much more interesting and beautiful place, especially for weirdos like me. And though your fans will miss you terribly, the lessons you've taught us will continue to influence others, just as they did Sam Lake. Hell, it motivated me to finally get my arse into gear and make a video, about which I was very self-conscious. But of the many things you've taught me, it's that if it means something to me, and it's something I want to say, I should just do it. And if it only resonates with one other person, well, then that's a worthwhile bonus. In gratitude and respect, Mr. Lynch, rest in beautiful blue skies and golden sunshine.
Also, the boys wanted me to wish you peace and happiness. And these guys aren't just a bunch of goofballs. They know that there's plenty of suffering in the world, and they spent many years with little iron hooks in their backs up on Sunset Boulevard. And but they tell me that there's this all-pervading happiness underneath everything. And the more time I spend with them, the more I believe it. And so we wish you peace and happiness. Thanks a million.
Just wanted to say, if you enjoyed the wonderful cover versions of Artie and the Janitor's music featured in this video, these were provided with the kind permission of Katja Savia. She is an independent artist from Remedy's home country of Finland, and I can't recommend her channel enough. She has a remarkable library of great film and video game cover tracks, as well as original music, inspired by precisely the kind of stories that, if you're watching content like this, I'm sure will be right up your alley. I've placed a link in the description. Please go give her channel a look. You won't regret it. Thank you so much for watching this through to the end. An additional motivation for making this video was to gain experience in using DaVinci video editing software, so if you have any constructive feedback or advice, I would welcome it in the comments. I'm planning to do more of these videos, so please like, subscribe, or even share if you are so inclined. I would sincerely appreciate the support. Thank you.